Kia ora koutou, no mai, haere mai, and welcome. And thank you for joining us this evening on this webinar, this New Zealand Choral Federation webinar about young people in choirs and what happens after school. Well, I'm Christine Argyle. I'm the Chief Executive of the New Zealand Choral Federation, and I'm joined this evening by David Squire, who is a board member of NZCF. He's also the chair of our ACD committee, the Association of Choral Directors. He's the conductor of the New Zealand Youth Choir, and he conducts a number of secondary school choirs as well. I'm also joined, thanks David, also joined by Megan Hernard, who is another of our board members. Megan's been a member of the New Zealand Youth Choir. She's a member of Voices New Zealand. Were you also in the New Zealand Secondary Students Choir, Megan?
No, unfortunately I was not.
No, but Megan's been was involved for many years with the Big Sing as a stage manager. Yes. So had that role behind the scenes. And Megan has engaged her work colleague, Daisy Duncan-Smith, to work on this project with us, doing some research into young people who have recently left high school, some who have continued singing and others who haven't, and the reasons why they have or haven't carried on singing. So welcome, Daisy, and thank you for the work that you've done on this. Thank you. Daisy, you are a lapsed choral singer yourself, aren't you?
I totally am, from school back in the UK, so yeah.
Yeah, so you're exactly the sort of person that we want to find out, what happened and why didn't you carry on? Yeah. So look, I'm going to hand over first of all to Megan to tell us and fill us in on the background to this study and how it came about.
So we've been having quite a few conversations at the board about youth singing. We see thousands of students eagerly participating in Big Sing in particular, but singing in general. And then all of a sudden, they leave school and we have no idea really why they don't continue singing. And we know that there are loads of choirs out there looking for additional singers. So kind of wanted to understand, where the gap was and what was happening for young people after school. And I think we had these hypotheses around, what we thought those reasons were. We talked about things like barriers with people starting university or new jobs and not having time and maybe not being as motivated. And I think you'll be really interested to see kind of what we found out, which was basically it was none of those things. So we decided, rather than just assume we knew, because for a few of us, it's been quite a long time since we left school. We should actually go and talk to some young people and hear from them about how they're finding that transition from school into a kind of a post-school environment and what's happening around their singing. So we put the call out for volunteers to join some focus groups, and we got a really great response from a range of young people across the country, and they were a bit of a mix of people that were singing, did a little bit of singing after school, some that didn't, some were stayed in the same location which they were at school, others had moved to different parts of the country or overseas. Yeah, some people had done traveling, some hadn't, some had started work, some hadn't. So it was quite a good mix. But the one thing they all had in common is that singing was one of those things that they felt really passionately about at school and have really fond memories about. So I was very lucky to tap on the shoulder, say, of my colleague, Daisy Duncan-Smith, who is works with me doing kind of customer experience research. So she's kind of helped craft the focus groups and the approach. And so what we're about to present now is the themes that came out of those discussions. So I'll hand over to Daisy now to tell you about what we found.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan. And thanks to the rest of the team for inviting me to take part in this research. It was a real pleasure and a real honor. We spoke to some really wonderful young adults, so it was lots of fun to do. I guess just to give you a bit of context around how the insights are structured as we go through them, from the workshops, Megan and I did some themings, and through that came up with 7 sort of high-level themes, which we're going to go through tonight. And as well as documenting some of the awesome ideas that came through during those discussions from our interviewees. I'm going to run through these insights, probably going to portion them up into 3 buckets, so we get some breaks for comments and questions in between, which would be great. And the way that they're structured is giving you a high-level flavour of what we found, some additional detail around actually how those themes ended up showing up in the conversations we had, and also providing some supporting quotes. So what did they actually say in their own words that kind of built up to this broader theme? And as well as those, we've got some kind of what we call how might we statements. So that was Megan and I looking at those insights and saying, well, what are the opportunities sitting behind some of these insights, and how could we leverage what's coming through? They're the ones that Megan and I came up with. You totally might come up with things that you see there as well, other opportunities. So if you've got those, please share them as well. That'd be great.
So if you have comments on the way through or questions that you'd like to ask, pop them into the chat. And as Daisy said, we're going to present these in chunks, and then we'll have a little break in between some of those themes to have a chat and be able to answer any questions that you've got on the way.
Cool, thanks, Megan. There is a bit of repetition across the themes, and some are quite linked and related, so that will start to come through as well as we go through. So here we go. Firstly, school choirs and choir directors are absolutely mega influencers. As we talked during the group sessions with the guys, it was really clear that choirs and choir directors at school have a huge lasting impact on their students' lives, to the point where it appears that kind of those experiences that they had at school are really still sitting with these students and setting them up for life beyond school. The huge passion with which the groups talked about their singing experiences at school came through overwhelmingly, and nearly all mentioned the influence that it had had on them to this day, which was really lovely, a really positive way to start those conversations with them. They talked about actually being at choir not just about learning to sing, but also about some of the values and disciplines that they picked up during that. And they're also putting those into practice now in their daily lives. There was a kind of tinge of sadness to the conversation as well, as we were talking about that. And that was kind of mostly around, I guess, a sort of sense of loss being felt, just as they were kind of nearing the end of time at school. And the idea that actually choir may not be a big part of their life ongoing. So there was certainly a sort of tinge of sadness felt by them, like what's going to happen, how's it going to be for me? And that actually had been such a huge part of their life, and maybe that was going to be lost for a time. It was a really positive way to start the discussion, as I said. And I guess the how might we around this is we saw a real opportunity to say, well, if they're feeling this passionate at this time, how might we leverage that passion when they're feeling it at the time, and not letting it dwindle before, I guess, supporting these students and helping them move on to post-school sort of singing experiences, and just, yeah, taking that on when it happens. And then number 2, and this may not be a surprise to many of you, that actually being in choirs was way more, than singing. It's about connection too. I guess the idea of being in a choir means that you're hanging out with people who actually get you, you're doing something you love together. Lots of discussion with the groups about the friendships they created and sustained through their choir experiences. And also, so with their own choirs, but also across the New Zealand network of choirs. So whenever they met up with other choirs at competitions and things like that. When we kind of applied this to what was happening in present day, our groups are still looking for that social connection and camaraderie. It was a really big part of their previous choir experience and what they were looking for in a choir that they were going to join. And actually, as Megan mentioned when she talked about our makeup of the groups, quite a few of them have moved for study or work. And actually they're moving to places where they may not know anybody. It's quite new. So being able to have a way of creating those new connections with friend groups was really important, as it can be quite daunting, as I'm sure many of you can attest to. And I guess here what Megan and I found really interesting is that these aspects of sort of social connection, camaraderie, were not always being felt in relation to the regional choirs that our groups sort of talked about and had experiences with. So thinking about that, our kind of how might we, or opportunity in this area was, if that's the case, how might we try and ensure where these aspects are present in choirs, because they probably are.
So Daisy, when you say the regional choirs, you mean the adult choirs that they may have gone on to sing with in the city that they ended up in?
Yeah, absolutely, Christine. Yeah, the choirs that they had observed and been part of. Just how do we make it really obvious to prospective choruses that these choirs do have a big part in them around social connection and camaraderie, and that's really overtly obvious, I guess, from the outside. Okay. And the other one that came up in our first kind of group of insights was actually a bit of a surprise, I think, and quite a hot topic. It came through by itself really naturally and really strongly. And that was about this idea of being able to compete. Definitely this concept of the experiences they'd had around competing since sort of leaving high school was more around performing for friends and family. And this is really nice and really lovely and a great experience, but it doesn't quite cut it for them. They talked a great deal about how much they enjoyed being involved in competitions like the Big Sing, valuing the opportunity to measure themselves up against others, that opportunity to get really constructive feedback from professionals, and also harking back to that kind of social connection idea, meeting up with peers and friends from other choirs, that actually that's really a good part of that competitive experience as well. They often thought that having that element of competition also helped drive good choir commitment and this idea of a common shared goal, and that actually to date they hadn't really found that in some of the choirs that they'd looked at and been part of since high school, that sort of level of commitment and drive to do really well and do something. More geared, as I said, toward those sort of annual performances with family and friends, which doesn't necessarily give them that level of satisfaction or sort of growth learning opportunity. They also talked a little bit about not just the competition itself and meeting up with friends, but the experience that goes into taking part in a competition. So really enjoying traveling to the venues together, being at the venues, connecting with people, finishing, getting in the bus, going on the way home, singing songs as a group as they're heading home after the competition, really on a high and being with everybody that they're getting along with and doing something that they love. So when Megan and I sort of stepped back and thought about this, we're thinking, well, how might we support kind of that standard level and commitment and learning needs that these choruses are looking for, or again, make it really overtly obvious where these are actually, I guess, aspects of the choirs that they're looking at. And also finding more opportunities potentially for choirs to compete, measure themselves against each other, potentially in different ways. So are there any other opportunities to kind of make that happen and make that more readily available for people? Okay, so I'm going to stop my share just there. See if we've got any comments or questions.
Great, thanks, Daisy. I'm just looking at the we've just had one question here, and she's missed the first slide. She's asking how many ex-students do we end up being able to talk to. That, can you just remind us again exactly how many students it was that took part in the survey or in the focus groups altogether?
I'll take that one. It was 11. 11,
yeah, thank you.
Majority was, North Island and South Island, yeah.
So there's some interesting themes that have come through there. The school choir directors being mega influencers, we're probably not surprised by that, but thinking about how those mega influencers ERS can help the pathway for students after they leave school, and I think that's something that's coming up a bit later as well, isn't it? In one of the other themes, the one about it being not just about the singing, but about connection and community. I think that's not a surprise, but clearly it is something that is not evident enough to young people looking for a choir to join, even if that is a big part of a choir's culture, an adult choir's culture, somehow that choir or the choirs that are out in our community are maybe not expressing their personality as a choir well enough, or what their culture is like. So there's a challenge there, isn't there, for choirs to be able to express their cultures better, so that young people who might be interested in joining can pick that up. And then that last one about the striving for competition, or at least, as you were saying, something to measure yourself against, even if it's not a competition per se with prizes and judges and all of that, but being able to measure yourself against other choirs, other peers. I know that if I can just speak to that one and then we maybe back up, I'd be really interested in David's thoughts perhaps on the first one with choirs as mega influencers, but just thinking about that idea of choirs measure or young people having the opportunity to sing in something. I think most of our regions run something called a Sing Fest, where choirs from the community come together and all perform throughout the day. Some of them are they just perform a song or two each and it's a festival. Others, they aren't adjudicated, but they do get feedback from a commentator, somebody like a judge, but not quite, but they're not, competing for prizes. And we did, in the several years ago, the NZCF did have something called the Classic Sing, which was supposed to be like an adult version of the Big Sing, and it was competitive. But we found that adult choirs in general didn't want to be ranked, didn't want to be judged and ranked in that way, which you can understand. So that's an interesting one to try and marry up that idea of young people wanting that drive. But it's not just about competition, is it? It's about having a really strong goal to work towards, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's the bit that came through quite strongly. They felt that the competition aspect, what it enabled the choirs to do and the choir directors to do, was really push the choir. So they felt, it just meant that they got stretched a lot more. And as a group, they were really lifting their standard, probably in a way that just preparing for a standard performance, they didn't always feel that they had. So it was that extra mile. I mean, knowing again that you're going to not just be, if your mum and dad turn up to a concert, to hear you sing, it'll, they'll come away saying, oh, that was lovely, and it was still a great experience. But if you know that there are going to be other choral singers watching you, it's just there's something about lifting that level. So as you say, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be prizes and levels. It's interesting, they didn't talk about the need to win. It was definitely not about the winning. It was about participating in something that had that, slightly competitive edge, and particularly be able to get that feedback from others that, knew about singing, and so therefore had a kind of a really kind of a valid viewpoint. Yeah.
Edge is the word there, isn't it?
Yeah. I find the whole thing about school choirs is that they are quite institutional. And therefore, you are able to run rehearsals and expect full attendance and, be quite demanding of the singers. And the secondary school students kind of expect that if they're working at that quite high level, because they know that that's what it takes to get to a certain point where I guess that competition can take place. The moment that you take them out of the school, there is a transition that we'll look at shortly, I'm sure, but that has to kind of take place, and their expectations are not going to be met if that's what they were kind of hoping for. And it's much harder, as community choir directors out there will know, to be able to provide opportunities like that, because there are lots of other pulls in other directions. So interesting to see how we might do that.
We've got some really interesting comments coming up in the chat about this whole competitive idea for adult choirs. And some people say, one comment is, I sing in an adult choir and most members either have family or job commitments or are at an age where they might feel too intimidated in a competitive atmosphere. And then another one says, I'm from the barbershop world, which has annual competitions. What other genres have competitions? So that's interesting, isn't it? In the choral world for adult choirs, we we shy away perhaps from this competitive element, but that's certainly not the case in barbershop. Yeah, so that's interesting.
Yep.
And perhaps that's a cultural thing, but certainly I imagine that with barbershop, that's one of the motivations, the things that really keep people motivated towards that competition. Megan, you've sung in a couple of ensembles that have gone over to international competitions, haven't you? And you might have a perspective on how that singing in a local ensemble that then took itself overseas to be part of a competition, what that did for the choir.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say I felt very similar to, I guess, what we were hearing from our students. There's definitely another level that you get to, and maybe it's a combination of the intensity of the group and the rehearsals, and partly it's because you're also getting an opportunity. And I don't know if we didn't really explore this so much with this group of singers, but to really get into a specific piece of group of repertoire that you're going to be preparing for competition. That's quite different than I think most choirs preparing for a performance. You don't really often have the luxury of getting it to a point where it's memorized or pretty much memorized. You're thinking about the staging, you're thinking about all the aspects and the communication with the audience. Because we kind of go from one performance to the next performance, and you're just kind of finishing one and starting rehearsals for the next one, the following week. But that sense of the shared goal, the sense of being able to see the standard of other choirs, I think was really, really fantastic. And I guess that's one thing that we will have coming up in 2024 with the World Choir Games is an opportunity in a way to for choirs to start thinking about, are they interested in participating and seeing choirs in that way.
You see, I wonder whether this element of edge, which is doesn't necessarily have to be competitive, but what it might mean is even just two choirs from the same city putting a concert on together, even that probably gives each of those choirs a bit of a sense of, gosh, maybe we don't want to come off looking not as good as that other choir that we're sharing the program with. So we better make sure that we're putting, our A game out there on the line. I wonder whether even just something like that, sharing a concert with another choir might be that sort of edge element that some people are looking for in a choir. Should we move on now to a couple more of the themes, and then we can always circle back, because we'll summarize again at the end those themes, and we can circle back to some of the other ideas if we don't feel we've explored them enough.
Awesome. Okay, share screen again. Okay. So this kind of follows on a little bit from our first theme, I guess, where we talked about choirs and choir directors as mega influences. Some of the experiences that are kind of the people we talked to when we were thinking about you're coming towards the end of high school, what's going to happen next. What came through a little bit from them was that they felt that some students were provided with recommended singing pathways, but actually on the flip side of that, some are not, and it's felt quite hard to do it themselves. There's a little bit of talk around the idea that sometimes it felt like students were cherry-picked for more support than others, and that information seems to be really hard to find or quite limited in their experience. So there's a real opportunity here, I guess, to leverage that passion that we talked about at the beginning, and how might we provide sort of more accessibility and guidance for more school leavers around their options to continue singing when they leave, at that kind of sweet spot when they're really feeling passionate about what they're doing, and helping provide them a pathway at that point, and what might be different ways that we could do that, especially given, I guess, that these young adults obviously hold their choral directors in really high regard. So having that advice from that trusted professional, I think, it could be really valuable at that point and actually make a real difference. Sorry. I think moving on to the next one. I think my screen's frozen, sorry. we go. And I get, actually, this speaks quite a bit, Christine, I think, to what you were just talking about around the comments, this idea that we talked quite in depth with the students about like, what would their ideal choir look like, I guess. And through that discussion, what came out is that there's kind of a sort of this transitionary phase. And it's a little bit about that competition, like they look at kind of performing for your family, friends, potentially as a kind of, could be later in life, but because they've just sort of come out of this experience at school when they've been singing and they've had that edge of competition, they're still looking for that. So they talked about those same experiences, and actually a choir they're looking for at the moment actually sounded, or when they talked about it, looked a little bit like their choir experience at school, right? That shared goal, good level of commitment, good levels of learning, and a real heavy dose of kind of fun and social connection. They often found or talked about finding with the choirs that they discovered after leaving high school, they kind of either sort of lacked a goal or a standard level that they were kind of used to, or a growth or learning opportunity. Or on the other side of that, they were potentially too intense. So really fine line between having this kind of fun side and social aspect to a choir, but actually real intensity, shared goal, aiming for something, aiming high. It's almost, you know, kind of looking for the best of both worlds, I guess, in those phases, and looking for something that encompasses both. I guess what's kind of interesting to note as we talked through this was the choirs they described they wanted to be in, on the flip side, often sounded like the choirs that they found a little daunting to join, which is quite interesting about what those sort of barriers to being able to join the type of choir, I guess, that actually would meet your interests and your preferences. And the other thing that sort of came up is that the regional choirs that they did talk about or discussed during the time that they'd looked at, that kind of would encompass these qualities, they're not always seeing from the outside that those qualities are within those choirs. So again, speaking back to what you mentioned, Christine, about how do you make the sort of the personality of that choir really overt and obvious, and share what that choir is about, so that people from the outside are actually seeing this and experiencing this, and then really know. So when we talked about the how might we around this, it's, you know, how might we sort of connect these singers with the choirs that kind of meet their needs or their wants, but also how do we help do that in a kind of sort of for them a safe way, where it feels approachable, it feels doable, and they want to come in because those are the choirs they're kind of looking at. And I think those are the next two. We're going to have another break before the next two, so I shall stop share.
So that's interesting, isn't it? This dichotomy somehow between wanting a choir that is really sort of high level, demanding, but finding that choir, you know, those sorts of choirs daunting to join. I guess is the whole idea about auditioning and how scary auditions can be and all that kind of thing. David, have you got thoughts around any of that?
So I think one of the things that I think is a little bit of a barrier that I'm not sure if this came up in the research or not, but there's quite a lot of rote learning at high school. And I think that there's probably a fairly large percentage of singers who leave high school and can't read particularly well. So in order to join the high level choirs that they're wanting, that what we could call a competitive element or sing more challenging repertoire, they actually have to be able to read. And there is an issue there that you know, we're going to have to deal with at some point. I do find it interesting that there's certainly an opportunity I see in that last slide that you had, Daisy, that's really important, is how we connect community choirs with big sing choir directors more and find ways of making that transition easier for young people. That's a massive opportunity for us.
Yeah, the aspect around auditioning definitely came up as well. It was one of those things that people did find quite daunting. And I think you can kind of understand it when, school, I know there's auditions for some school choirs, but a lot of the kids that we talk to, they didn't necessarily have to audition when they first started singing at school. And so, the idea, it just felt like quite a big barrier for them to be able to participate. And I think your point around, the level of musicianship needed around being able to read music in an audition was definitely seen as a barrier from those students. But the other thing, I guess, David, I'd be quite keen to hear your thoughts on as well, was the theme before, which was around transition. Is there anything more that we could be, particularly, I guess, choir directors of school choirs could be thinking about around how do they prepare students for that transition, knowing that the way of operating in a school environment is really different than the way a choir operates in a community environment.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a strong believer, as many other big sing choir directors are, that you have to prepare singers for a lifetime of singing in choirs. And for many of them who want to sing the sort of repertoire that they're singing at the big sing beyond high school, there has to be an element of musical literacy that is developed at high school. Because if it's not there by the time they leave school, it's quite hard to pick it up later on, unless they have a lot of gumption, I guess, and are prepared to go past those initial anxiety barriers about joining a choir and learning the skills that are required to be in that choir and being prepared. I think it's also hard for some of them who come out of high school where they're, the leaders of their choirs and they've got a lot of mana, to come out of that and come into a position where they're the novices in some of those adult choirs. So that can be incredibly intimidating. So yeah, there are some things that we can look at for giving big sing directors some more skills about developing musicianship and developing that resilience that enables them to go into those adult choirs and contribute meaningfully.
There are a couple of good suggestions in the chat, or good comments in the chat. One of them about possibly, workshops with community choirs and school choirs combined. So, and especially in smaller centres, that could be something that NZCF, as I said, has sing fests in smaller centres. I know the one in Invercargill last year had a real range of choirs, adult choirs, school choirs, and so on. But this suggestion is also workshops too, so that might be where young people, some school choirs and adult choirs, come together and do some workshopping, and the students get to see what these other choirs are like and how their directors work. That might be a way of a positive thing. Also, Rosemary asked about, I wonder how many youth choirs. I wonder if there's an opportunity for youth choirs or other adult community choirs to be. I know that, sorry, this is it's moved, the chat's moved. I wonder how many cities and towns have youth choirs. Maybe youth choirs could invite school choirs to join them in a shared event. And also, Blake says, I wonder if there's an opportunity for youth choirs or other adult community choirs to be showcased at the Big Sing. Guest performances at gala concerts. I certainly know as far as when we get to the finale level, I know that timing and scheduling is a real issue, and probably in a lot of the regionals too. But that's not a bad idea, and especially where if regions have time and not as many choirs that they've got to try and get into one gala concert. I also know I've sung in a choir in Wellington that has frequently put on concerts with school choirs, and also on one occasion it was a women's voice thing where there were 16 women in the choir and 16 young women from 4 different high schools sat alongside each of us to be mentored and to sing together in this concert, and that was a great initiative too. But the thing about a community choir putting on a concert with a school choir is that the winning thing about that, not only does the choir get the opportunity and the young choirs get to sing with the community choir, but in terms of an audience, because all those young people bring their parents, those concerts sell out. It's financially a really great idea as well, you know. So there's a lot of positives about adult and secondary school choirs coming together and putting concerts on together. Another thought here from Virginia: there are so many of these moments in life. This is one of the biggest transitions, moving on from school. And she then agrees with you, with David Hamilton, and says you have to be more proactive to seek out these opportunities when you leave school. David says school choirs are a part of a recognisable community where students are trapped for 6 to 7 hours every day. It's easier to have a profile within school. Choirs and schools are there and accessible, and that's absolutely so true, isn't it? You know, you've got a captive audience in a school, not so much in the community, but nonetheless, community choirs, it seems, need to find ways of expressing their culture, making that visible, making it understandable, perhaps. Yeah. So look, I think it's time to go on to the next couple of slides, Daisy, and then we'll circle back again.
Sure. Okay. So last couple of themes. Most in the groups that we talked to had obviously done some looking around for choirs since high school, and they'd done this mostly by talking to friends, previous choir directors, and obviously kind of relying on Google, as most of us would. And while this did sort of bear some fruit for them, I think what came through for us is that it didn't often quite provide them with enough information, I guess, for them to work out whether a choir might be the right fit for them. And this speaks a little bit already to what you talked about, Christine, about the culture of choirs. It's almost like, I guess, there's a two-way audition process. They want to know kind of the feel of the choir, the culture, what the director is like, how the choir operates or works. They want to know what they're getting into. They want to know if it's going to tick the boxes for what they're looking for, as we kind of mentioned before, around what the ideal aspects are. What was kind of clear is that actually what they couldn't find was kind of a single source of truth on New Zealand choirs available to them. So definitely there came through this, how might we provide, I guess, a single source of truth. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about that, Christine, with the NZCF page, but also like, how do we provide a more of a 360-degree view, I guess is the way we described it, of a choir, putting a bit more meat on the bones so people kind of get a feel for the choir from having a look and browsing through. And also this kind of idea that came through actually when we were talking to them about, is there a way that potentially we could make those connections between choirs looking for choristers and choristers looking for choirs? They're looking for each other, but can't quite find a way to find each other. So is there a way that that we might be able to sort of support that? Frozen screen again. Here we go. Okay. And our last theme, and we kind of put this last because it came up and it was something that we wanted to talk about because we kind of had assumptions around this, but it was about time and money being a factor. Neither of these topics really came up by themselves. Megan and I asked quite direct questions to kind of generate some conversation around this, which actually we found quite surprising, as I said, because one of our big assumptions was going into the research was that these young adults are too busy, they're at school, they've got jobs, they don't necessarily have the time to commit to sort of yet another thing, I guess, to add to their list of things to do. But as I said, none of these groups kind of brought it up without us kind of giving them the nudge, which is really interesting. What it sort of boiled down to in terms of the time factor, I guess, was almost sort of thinking about, I guess, the equal value exchange around this. What it seemed like is they're prepared to put in a decent amount of time if that choir experience to them is going to be worth it. Is it providing what they need? Is it ticking those boxes? Is it giving them growth, learning opportunities? Are they getting social connection? Is there a level of measuring up against other people, that kind of competitive nature we talked about, and those real shared committed goals? We did ask specifically, like, how much time would you think was fair? And of course, it kind of varied depending on who we spoke to. Like, there was no kind of common theme, but sort of overall, when we talked about, some of them mentioned, I'd be prepared to commit the same amount of time that I did actually during my choir time at high school. but obviously kind of thinking more about evenings and weekends rather than during the day, because most of them either studying or they've got work. And money came up again, because we kind of nudged that question and asked specifically. But actually, when we talked about money, mostly to them, what naturally came out was it's actually in relation to events, competitions, and performances. And sometimes the cost of these for them could be prohibitive. Prohibitive. You know what I mean? It might. So if we kind of want to understand more about this, there's obviously opportunities to do further research if it feels like something that we want to test more. But we didn't spend too much time on it because it didn't really come up naturally during the conversation. Cool. Those last two insights, Christine.
Yeah, I wanted to mention, because you said that the idea came up that people wanted a website that you could go to find out about New Zealand choirs. And I think maybe students looking for choirs may not realise that the New Zealand Choral Federation website does have just that. I think a lot of our member choirs even may not realise that they have a page on our website and that they have a login to update it, and if they can keep that updated, that would be a tool. And we also have links to them. And I just thought I would share the screen very briefly to show what that looks like on the New Zealand Choral Federation website and where that is. So currently, and we are just about to upgrade or change the homepage, and I can show people what that will look like. But we do have at the bottom, which is going higher up in the new version, a Find a Choir section where people can search under a town or city, and also search under a choir type to filter for a choir in their area. And then we have in the regional pages, and I'm just going to show an example, for example, East Coast. If we go to our East Coast page, then on each of our regional pages, there's member choirs in the region. And when you click on that, there's a list of choirs. That's our member choirs. And of course, this is not exhaustive because choirs that are not members of the Choral Federation are not there. So there are others, of course, too. But if we went to one, and this is a good example, Cantare, the first one on the list in East Coast. And here it tells you who the conductor is, what night they rehearse, where they rehearse, how to contact them, a link to their own website, and also a nice little blurb here that says it's an auditioned a cappella choir, performs music from throughout history, etc. Members need good reading skills and are expected to learn their music individually so they can come to weekly rehearsals ready to work on vocal blend and tuning as they aim to constantly improve and refine their sound. And I thought that's a really good example of a choir saying who they are, what they're about, what they expect. And so we do have that on our website, and in the new look homepage, which hasn't been launched yet, that's going to come much higher up. So you'll see the Find a Choir is more prominent and higher up in that. But another thought that sort of a couple of things that I've seen, for example, one of the vocal ensembles that came to Choral Connect in July, they had on their homepage a really great video of who they were and what it was about, and they had individual choir members talking about what the culture of the choir is like, why they love it, what it is, and what's expected of them. It was a really engaging kind of 2-minute video on their homepage, which I thought was a great thing. And another thing that I think was another example, we talked about auditions and that sometimes being off-putting and people, not sure what to expect and feeling daunted by it. The New Zealand Secondary Students Choir, when they came up to their round of auditions, they had this great little video with Brent Stewart and Rachel Alexander talking people through what the audition process would involve and what they would need to do to prepare for it. And again, that was engaging. these two people didn't look scary, you know, so if you were thinking of auditioning for that choir, you'd know what to expect. You'd have an idea of what the people were going to be like and whether it was going to feel intimidating or not. So I think those are a couple of simple things that choirs could do and put on their website or put on their Facebook page to help people know more about them and find the right choir.
Yeah, I think a lot of the information that choirs usually put on their pages, understandably, are about the music that they sing, and obviously that is really important. But the one thing I found quite fascinating talking to our young people is that they were really interested in a real range of music, and so it wasn't the musical genre wasn't necessarily the thing that they were looking for, because they were very open to singing almost any style of music. But it was very much what was the choir director like? What is the feeling of the choir? Definitely, what's the kind of culture? What's the social aspect? So if there's anything that choirs feel is kind of special about them and how they are together, in those kind of more cultural aspects, I think it sounds like it's really important to be able to highlight that in the information about your choir.
David, have you got thoughts on that?
I'm really liking the fact that there's comments in the chat coming up about collaborations. I mean, collaborations are one of the really important things that we can do in the choral world that won't necessarily give that competitive awards atmosphere, but it will certainly give that competition against your own ability to be able to perform to the best of your ability, and you're showing off to other singers. And I think that's one of the things that is one of the really special things about Big Sing, is that certainly at Finale, but at regional level as well, is that the choirs are incredibly supportive of one another because they love excellence, and they know what it takes to make things happen. They know how hard that is and how hard students will have had to work to get to that level. And so they like supporting other people who do it. So community choirs collaborating and singing different music to one another, building audiences, that sort of thing is going to be really important. The other thing that I've seen a couple of times recently, and I'm delighted to see community choirs reaching out a bit more, is that there was a choir on the shore recently that did an open evening, an open rehearsal, and they basically sent out invitations to young people from all around the shore and said, come and join us, no strings attached, come along for a night, sit in, you can sing or you can just watch if you want to, and we'll put supper on at the end and you can talk to us about what it's like to be in our choir. And I mean, that's fairly simple, doesn't cost a lot of money. It helps the community choir also to evaluate what is it that we stand for, what is it that we do, why do we love doing this? It helps you figure out what your values and your vision is for the choir.
Some choirs reach out to young people by offering scholarships as well, don't they? And that might either be a fees waiver, if depending on how much the fee to join the choir for the year is, or it might go as far as actually paying those students, or those young, let's say a university age student, or if you're not in a university town, young sort of potential soloist type recent school leavers, to encourage them to come and join your choir, to pay them. It might only be a small amount, but that can often be worth it to those young singers who maybe it pays for their singing lessons for the year, and they're a young aspiring soloist or someone who wants to go on and study. So I mean, it's another incentive to consider, I guess.
Absolutely.
Should we go on to just final sort of other ideas that came up, Daisy?
Certainly. Okay, short and sweet. So yeah, a few ideas came through the conversation, and actually they probably relate quite well to sort of the insights that we've already talked about. Certainly kind of, I guess, what could be considered as a low-hanging fruit that Christine's talked about the choir director, and greater visibility of sort of the culture of the choirs. How could we do that and make that more seen for people? Some of the other things that came up that probably need a bit more kind of validation and effort to understand was potentially this idea about choir chorister sort of matching. Choir, getting choirs looking for choruses and choruses looking for choirs, and how do we help match those up. Around that, and additional competition or performance opportunities, or in different ways. So I already heard some of the comments coming through about different ways that potentially could happen, which is really awesome. And some stuff about, is there a way to be more proactive about information sharing, particularly, I guess, during that transition phase that we talked about? Is there anything that we could do to support making sure that people leaving high school get some visibility of what's out there at that time? So somebody came up with the idea of signing everyone up to receive a newsletter, and that sort of thing. So there's potential around there. Is there opportunity to create a sort of youth presence to feed into the board for the NZCF, and bring in some sort of youth, sort of more permanent youth voices, I guess, which was really exciting, hearing them talk about being sort of board members, and that was really cool. This idea of interim or transition choirs, or I guess a transitionary experience, and then another choir and chorus to matching it, obviously had to go on twice. Yeah, so those are the sorts of things that came up. The other thing that was really cool was the groups that we talked to, I think, really valued actually being part of the conversation, and certainly expressed a real interest in being part of the conversations going forward, testing ideas, you know, and helping refine some of these suggestions. So I thought that was really awesome that they were keen to stay across that as well.
That idea, people may wonder about the idea of an interim choir or transitional choir, but I guess the idea around that was more like a youth choir, a choir specifically for school leavers. Is that right?
Yeah, but also that idea of, again, almost like non-audition, maybe it's almost like your Big Sing alumni turn up, you know, at the start of your next year, and all of your year 13 students or from the previous year could come and be part of a project or something like that at the start, you know, again, sort of almost no strings attached. But the concept that it wouldn't be somewhere that you'd stay for a long time, it was more about how do you start helping to get used to operating in a non-school environment to help transition, and then potentially help find those pathways. But I think we've already talked about, and I think there'll be some great conversations about whether that is better to happen at school, or whether that happens post-school. So I think that's one of the areas for discussion.
You got thoughts about that, David? A sort of post-school singing opportunities?
I kind of like the idea, but I don't want to kind of create a sort of an alumni thing where they're just recreating the school experience. I think it's important that it is transitional, and that the community choirs have input into that as well. So yeah, like maybe guest conductors or something that could work. It's a possibility.
I think there's also something in that though they suggested that idea, when we talked about their ideal choir, like, we know there's choirs that exist that offer those things, they just don't know about it. So maybe I just don't know that there's a choir out there for me, so I'm thinking we need something different for us as well.
In the chat we've got, it's hard for community choirs to get the word out to potential singers. There's no assembly you can speak at. Advertising can be expensive, and that's true. There are some Facebook groups. There's one called Choral Singers in New Zealand, but I can imagine that if you were posting on that one saying, you know, just about every second choir would be posting saying we're looking for tenors. And yeah, if you were a tenor as part of that group, you'd be spoilt for choice. But you know, there are some channels like that that you can get the word out through. But yeah, certainly with NZCF, we are wanting to continue talking about some of these ideas and looking at ways that we can support this further, and whether you know, there could be an event, perhaps some kind of annual event for ex-big singers or something, you know, that so that is something we're keen to look at and discuss further. One question that came up, and perhaps just before we wrap up, a question that came up earlier on was around I guess the what can we take from a sample size of only 11 people, and Megan and Daisy, or Daisy particularly, this is your area, isn't it? And you can speak to how valid are focus groups in general, and what can we take away from a sample size that small?
Typically, so the research I've done kind of in my normal work life, we usually aim to talk to between 8 and 12 people. That's kind of the basis. And I guess, because once you've got a majority of those 8 to 12 people saying similar things about something, you're saying 80% of the 10 people we spoke to are saying very similar things. I think that's where you kind of get that that kind of insight bias and that thing coming through, is because actually quite a lot of the people we spoke to saying the same thing. I think that the more important thing actually is making sure you get that diversity of thought across that 12. So making sure that we got a spread across New Zealand, males and females, different ages. That's actually probably more important than the number, to be fair, because making sure that we're seeking diverse thought, and actually when those diverse people are saying similar things, it can carry quite a bit of weight. So as Megan and I started theming up all the things that came through, you start to see, well, there's 6 or 7 of the group are saying something around this, but actually 1 or 2 only mention this. So you go, probably that's not worthy of saying something. So all the things that we get, lots of other things came through, but we kind of discarded them in favor of the things where there was the most amount of kind of concepts and conversation coming through.
And although it looked like there was only one from the South Island, for example, I know that one of your people in a focus group had gone to school in Dunedin. So they were now living in Auckland or Wellington or something. So there was a bit more of a spread. And I know that you also had quite a spread of ethnic backgrounds too, didn't you?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it was a really good, surprisingly good mix. And we did the first 2 focus groups, and the themes were really, really consistent, which is we ended up doing an extra interview because I was concerned about that. I was like, oh, have we just not got a strong enough mix? And then we ran this extra interview and went, oh, he's saying exactly the same things that we heard in the other 2 focus groups. So I think at the point where you're hearing the same things over and over again, you kind of know that you have had. I think you've got a legitimate themes coming through.
Some incredibly heartening things from those results and from the comments. And when people get the entire document and they're able to see all of those individual comments that people have said, I know, having read through them, I was like, wow, that's amazing that choral music has had such a very strong impact on these young people. And what do we have, 10,000 kids involved in Big Sing every year, and those aren't even all of the students who sing in high school choirs, because they don't all do Big Sing. If we can get 10% of those leaving school to go and sing in a community choir beyond school, that's massive for the development and growth of our community choirs. I also really love the fact that they want to be involved in, they want to contribute. They don't just want to come in and be fed. They actually want to come in and contribute to governance and organisation and social things, being on committees, being involved, being adult. And that's very heartening.
So I guess where to from here? And what I can say is that this video will stay up on our YouTube channel. It'll be able to be watched afterwards for people who weren't able to be here at this time, and it'll be able to be watched again. We'll also send it out, do an article on it in the next e-brief, which will come out, I think it's the 1st of October, it's whatever the Friday is. And so there'll be a link to it in e-brief, and we'll also include Daisy's research pack. We'll include that as well in that article. And so that will be there. I can put a link to the research findings with this YouTube listing as well. We just need to do a little bit of, I think, just some final edits to it before we put that up. So that might be a day or 2 yet. But and when I just say edits, just a few things to tidy up, and also to protect some privacy in there. And we'll put it on the resources page of the NZCF website too. But in terms of further discussions, I think what would be, we will definitely, the NZCF board has a strategy day in November, early November. So youth insights and youth initiatives is a big part of that day and the discussions on that day. But I think it would also be great to have a discussion, a further discussion on the ACD Facebook group page, a Zoom session for directors, choir directors, to discuss this further and actually have the chance, rather than just putting things in the chat box, but to be able to talk with each other. Because I mean, there are two sides to this. Some of the chat that I've seen in the chat box looked a little bit like people might have thought we were saying Big Sing choir directors need to do more to give students the pathway. It's a two-way thing. Well, it's a two-part thing. I think it's the choir directors at school helping young singers know, get a clue at least of where to go to look after that. But it's also about the community choirs marketing themselves better, or at least getting their messages out better about who they are, what they're about, and so that young people can try and figure out which of them is the choir for them. So look, it's 8 o'clock now. Thank you everybody for joining us, everyone who's joined us online and has put comments in the chat box. Thank you so much. Thank you to David for your insights. Thank you, a huge thank you to Megan, who initiated this, and massive thanks to Daisy, who has just done this pro bono, voluntarily, and put such a lot of really great work and brought so much expertise and knowledge to this whole way of researching, and finding out. So thank you so much for that, and we'll continue to build on this. So ngā mihi, everyone. Thanks for coming, and ka kite anō.